Alton Byers, welcome to Nepali Times Studio.
Thank you.
Great to have you back from the mountains. You spent 6 months in the Kanchenjunga area. Kanchenjunga, the third highest mountain in the world. And it's not the first time you've been there.
No.
So what was the purpose of your visit this time?
Well, the first time we were there was in 2019, and it was part of an NSF grant that we had, National Science Foundation grant, to look specifically at glacier and glacier hazards. That turned into a number of different insights and publications. But this time, this was funded by the Fulbright Research Program. And I wanted to get back to something I've actually been studying a long time as well, which is alpine ecosystems. Okay, how do we protect and restore alpine ecosystems, not just in the Himalayas, but also in the Andes and other mountain areas in the world? And I had this sort of a theory that, well, with the return of tourism after COVID, we were going to see the same scenario I've seen acted out in Khumbu and Makalu and Langtang, etc., which is that people would build lodges, and the lodges up in the Alpine, you're in the land above the trees, right? So what do you use for fuel? You use local shrubs. And when you pull out these shrubs, many of which can take 200 years to grow this big around, then you start a process of disturbing the environment and accelerating degradational processes.
Makalu has that a lot, and Barun.
The Khumbu especially.
Also,
yeah. The Khumbu, this happened back in around 2000 when they started building lodges up in the Alpine region and started burning tons and tons and tons of shrub juniper. So I was afraid maybe this was happening in the Kanchenjunga region as well. So I went up and hoped to do what we did in the Khumbu and Makalu and elsewhere, which was to get the baseline data, to figure out what is happening, then share the results with local people, local stakeholders, and then see what they think. In the case of the Khumbu, they decided to create, back in 2005, their own Khumbu Alpine Conservation Council. And overnight, they stopped the cutting of shrub juniper. So it was a very rewarding, satisfying experience. And I thought, well, maybe we'll find the same in Kanchenjunga.
But Kanchenjunga doesn't face the same traffic of trekkers and mountaineers as the Khumbu.
No.
So what did you find?
And it doesn't have the same climate. It has, much more rainfall, as we discovered in June, July, and August, when we were trekking constantly, and it was raining constantly. But what I found over the years is that usually the wetter the environment, the more forgiving the disturbance processes can be.
But you went to Kanchenjunga in your previous visit.
Yeah.
To look at and study historical glacial lake outbursts.
Yeah.
And if you look at the topography of most of the main rivers in Nepal, you'll see, major bluffs have happened. Pokhara Valley was probably a result of that. And what was your source of information about these previous historical outbursts? Because at that time there were no satellite images, and very few people went up there.
Right.
So who did you depend on for that information? And why is that important to study historical bluffs?
Right, because, well, the impetus for the project was when I looked at ICIMAD, an ICIMAD publication on glacial lakes. And ICIMAD's done a very good job over the years of classifying glacial lakes and counting glacial lakes, etc. And this had a list of all the glacial lake outburst floods that had happened in Nepal, known bluffs. And it was something like 26 or something. And then I looked over, and there in the Kanchenjunga region, there is one.
Okay.
There's a record of one glacial lake outburst lake, a flood from Nangama Lake, which is up in the northern area. So we said, let's go and take a look at this. And on the way up to Nangama Glacial Lake to try and get develop an estimate of how big was the flood, how much water came out, what damage did it do, we started talking to older people. The older gentleman that we talked to had a remarkable knowledge of the past 50 years. And instead of one glacial lake outburst flood, in the course of our interviews, we were able to document 8 different floods in the last, well, the first one was 1921. Most of the others, the 7 others, began sometimes in the 60s, like everything else began in the 60s. Then our remote sensing specialist, Dr. Mohan Chand from Hokkaido University, was able to go back and confirm, yes, indeed, there was a major glacial lake flood from this glacial lake back whenever. But now we had a date, we had a rough date of when this happened. So that shows you the benefit of it in including local people in the research process, which unfortunately, a lot of glaciologists still don't do.
Alton, I remember you were involved about 6-7 years ago in this amazing project to take Nepali scientists to the Andes,
right,
and to bring scientists from Peru to Nepal to study the impact of climate and environment.
Right.
What came out of that? I mean, and why was it interesting?
I was the co-manager of the Makalu National Park in '95. And when I went back to the U.S., where I worked for the Mountain Institute, the director said, we've had a Himalayan program for 10 years. I want an Andes program. So she sent me down, right out off the plane from Nepal. I went down to Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and settled on Peru as a place to start an Instituto de Montaña, okay, in the Mountain Institute in Peru. And then I started developing an interest in glaciers, glacial lake outbursts, floods, and noticed that the Peruvians had been having GLOFs, okay, since the 1940s. And that they had lost thousands of people in the process, thousands and thousands.
The one in Huascaran, right?
Yes, Huascaran was 1970, but in the 1940s there was a major outburst from Pacococha that killed 3,000 people. Then 2 others that killed a total of 10,000 people. So the Peruvians got together, the engineers, and they did an assessment of all the lakes in the Cordillera Blanca. They found that 35 were potentially dangerous. And on their own, they developed the mechanisms to reduce or eliminate the hazard. And that could be everything from digging a ditch, a little ditch, scratching a ditch in the ground, to a major project of drilling through 1 kilometer of solid rock, okay, and having a system of valves and pumps to where you could lower the water or let the water increase. They did this for 35 different lakes, and they hadn't had an outburst since that time. So I figured, well, what about Nepal? And that's where I got the idea. By that time, I'd received a grant from the U.S. Agency for International Development called the High Mountain Adaptation Partnership. And I decided to bring a delegation of Peruvians and scientists from all over the world, Europe, the U.S., to Nepal. And I did that in September of 2011. And it was different from the typical delegation in that we went to Imja Lake. Okay, I took these 25, 30 scientists up to Imja Lake to exchange experiences and how they controlled lakes, and also to share.
Imja Lake is the one that wasn't in mountaineering maps from 25 years ago and is now 2 kilometers long.
Exactly. And as you'll see in my new book, Khumbu Since 1950, I have a photograph taken by Erwin Schneider in 1955 when it was a debris-covered glacier. And then another one that I took, first in 2007, it's a kilometer-long lake with 90 million cubic meters of water.
That was when?
That was in 2007.
And since then
it's grown, yeah, by other tens of millions of cubic meters of water. So I took them up there, and as a matter of fact, it was very fruitful because one of the scientists from Peru, Cesar Portocarrero, stayed on, was hired by the UNDP, and helped the Nepal government lower Imja Lake by 3 meters. So here's an exchange of Andean technology with Himalayan technology.
Great.
So you have an increase in the number of floods. What are people doing? They're building gabions, building more gabions. What's another thing? They're building bridges that are higher. Okay, because the bridges keep getting washed away here. Well, you build a higher bridge. They're learning an informal system of zoning, where it was perfectly fine to build a hotel in a nice flat area next to the river. They're not going to be doing that again. And they're not going to be doing it in Yangle Karka in the Burun, which we have a video.
You studied that too?
Yeah, we studied that flood too in 2017, and we have footage by a German climbing team of that whole hotel just floating away. Okay, well, and 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, they had rebuilt on higher ground.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're not waiting for some consulting firm on the Beltway in Washington, D.C. to tell them how to adapt to climate change.
You know, Alton, while we're speaking here in Kathmandu today, in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, world leaders are meeting to decide what to do about climate change and loss and damage, adaptation. What should Nepal be doing to prepare for these things? Because this is going to endanger hydropower projects, roads, bridges, villages, settlements, and it's going to be more frequent in future.
Right, right.
What should Nepal be doing as a nation?
I think one of the things that you could immediately do is that since there's so much hydropower being developed in Nepal right now, and yet glacial lakes are not factored into the environmental impact or consequence process. And yet they are a clear danger upstream. Take the Arun, for example. I think there are 3 different dam projects on it. And just right up in the Barun Valley, there's the massive lower Barun glacial lake, which is every year the glacier recedes and calves further and further, and in about 10 years, it's going to be directly under the Barun icefall. And that's when it could be especially dangerous. And you know, why lose a multi-billion-dollar project with something?
Projects.
And projects. Not only that, but there are glacial lakes in Tibet. Yeah. And you know that there's no monitoring system. So somehow, I think it'd be great if the hydropower industry could start incorporating the threat of glacial lake floods.
Also transborder ones.
And transborder. Look at the transborder ones. You know, you've got to develop those early warning systems with China in order to prevent major hazards downstream.
Alton Byers, thank you very much.
Thank you.